Hello, everyone. Welcome to another episode of The Person You Want to Be. I am your host, Eric Teplitz. Today, I am honored to have with me as my guest on the podcast, Pat Wetzel. Pat Wetzel is, among other things, a cancer survivor, adventure traveler, pilot, and storyteller. After graduating from the Wharton School at the University of Pennsylvania, she embarked upon a career in finance, but was sidelined from this by a rare neurological disease. She would experience a series of trials and tribulations in the years to come that would force her to forge a new identity for herself in almost every way. Out of a strong desire to understand how other people successfully navigated the serious challenges in their lives, Pat started her own podcast, Bump in the Road. She has recently authored a book entitled Bump in the Road, 15 Stories of Courage, Hope, and Resilience, in which she shares her own story, as well as those of some of her remarkable podcast guests. Pat Wetzel, welcome to The Person You Want to Be.
Hi, Eric. Thanks. It's really nice to be here.
I'm so happy to have you here. And I would like to just dive right in with my favorite starting question, which is to ask you to think back about your earliest childhood memories. And specifically, what I am looking to parse out would be anything that stands out to you about your earliest impulses about what it is you wanted to do or be, or what you were just naturally drawn to like a magnet. If anything stands out in that general area, I'd love for you to talk about it. And if you could also give us a little bit of context describing the environment in which you grew up.
Well, early on, I always loved to read. I was the kid who went down to the library, got 6 books, rode my bicycle home, read them all, and returned them before the due date. And rinse and repeat. Early on, I was interested in writing, but I didn't have a clear path to that. I didn't really know where it would go. It was just an interest that was out there, and it's taken me decades to come back to it. But growing up, I have one dream I remember so vividly. And at the time, it had no context for anything. I lived in a 2-story house up on a hill, big white house on a hill. And I remember floating out of my bedroom, flying. And it's probably a pretty common dream that kids have. But I'm flying and I flew down the staircase and I flew through the dining room and I flew through the kitchen and I flew back up. And it's probably a very common dream, but for some reason, that dream has always stayed with me. And that it's so curious that it has, because, fast forward a few decades and I'm off flying motorless airplanes. For a little more context, my family traveled a lot. My father was a poor kid prior to World War II, a first generation immigrant into this country. And obviously, he went off to World War II, like all of his peers did. He became a bombardier navigator for a B-17, and he flew with the 8th Army Air Force. So here he went from poor kid to these extraordinary and horrific experiences. The flak, the blood on the plexiglass nose of the airplane, everything. And I remember him telling a story about going hunting or something with an earl or somebody who owned this huge house. Because if you recall any of the movies in history of World War II, a lot of the men were stationed at these massive estates dotted all over the English countryside. So he comes back home alive, which alone was amazing. And I think that the reason I tell this story is I think that really influenced him. It really opened his view of the world. It made him very appreciative of many things. And as a result of that, I grew up traveling. From the time I was about 6 months old, I was on a plane or a ship or something somewhere. It could be as simple as going to California back then, or we spent a lot of time in Europe every year. So that was a really fundamental set of experiences that molded me and molded my childhood.
Great answer. I love it. And it certainly proves, as we get to know you and your story, very relevant, these pivotal sort of experiences in childhood. The dream is fascinating. Have you had repeated dreams throughout your life about flying, or is
Not
it
that
just
I
that one that
recall,
seems
but I
okay?
remember that one. And
Yeah.
I was young. I don't know how old I was, but for whatever reason, that dream has always stuck with me.
Hmm. Very interesting. Thank you for sharing that. And whereabouts did you grow up? Where was home?
Upper Saddle River, New Jersey, which is up on the New York State border. It's a beautiful part of, or it was, I haven't been back for many years,
Hmm.
a beautiful part of the country, just lots of rolling countryside, farms. There was an egg farm in town. You know, we'd go to the farm stores to get a lot of produce and things like that. There were supermarkets, certainly, but they were in other towns. You had to drive to them. So it was just extremely suburban.
Mhm. Okay. So as you moved through childhood, taking out library books and returning them on time along the
No,
way,
early.
oh, early, right, right, early. Um, were there any other like ideas that you had as you moved, let's say, through grade school, of either just things that became really strong interests or ideas that you had of who it was you were going to be when you grew up, so to speak?
You know, I was really fuzzy on that. I knew that I really liked to write. I always wrote well, did well in all those sorts of classes, but I didn't have any really strong particular drive. I went to business school largely as a practical matter.
Hmm.
Um, I enjoyed the kind of strategic 30,000 foot view of things. I mean, it was really cool back. This is pre-internet. It was really cool to read the Wall Street Journal and go, I'm working on that deal. You know, that it was fun stuff. Um, but I hadn't really planned to go that way per se.
Interesting. Were there any expectations put upon you, or even thinking back, maybe whether they were stated overtly or not? Were there any expectations of you, let's say, from your family as to, what you were supposed to be doing with your life?
Yeah, that was supposed to support myself when I was done with school.
Okay, got it. But they weren't attached to you entering a particular profession or any
No,
such thing. Okay.
no.
Yeah. And so you graduated from Wharton
Mhm.
and you went immediately to Wall Street from there. Is that right?
Yeah, I went to work actually. I wanted to work in the commodities market, but those jobs just were very boutique and they were not open to women at the time. And I was very fortunate actually to get a job in the direct placement market, which is a segment of the bond market. It's essentially a private market where we structured deals for large corporations that were outside the marketplace. And that became important as interest rates rose, and there weren't any of the normal economic markers that would make sense of the times that we were living in. I was working when interest rates hit 20%. You know, we had an office pool to see when they would break 20%. It was a really unusual time economically and historically, for that matter.
So you encounter I don't know if this is your first major quote unquote bump in the road, which by the way, this is the name of your podcast, name of your book. And I love how just understated it is because you'll see what I mean, listeners, as we go through Pat's story. Um, one other question, actually, before we go into the first bump in the road that I'm aware of.
Mhm.
This is just something I'm curious about, given what I already know about your story and what you've experienced in your lifetime, much of which could never have been anticipated, to say the least. And that is, did you have, as part of your upbringing, was religion at all a part of your upbringing, or did you have any kind of spiritual orientation uh, growing up, would you say?
No, none. My mother was an unpracticing, unreligious Catholic. She
Mhm.
wanted us to receive First Communion. And the whole thing struck me as really odd. I mean, they had this semi-dead guy up in a cross everywhere.
Semi-dead.
And everything you did was wrong. You were bad, you
Hmm.
were evil. And I just never connected with any sort of organized religion. I mean, later in my life, as life has gone on, I've become very spiritual. And I
Hmm.
think that there are great spiritual traditions in every religion.
Hmm.
But the idea of an organized religion has never really been in my ballpark.
Got it. Just was just curious about that. So you're working on Wall Street. You're seeing deals written about in the paper that you're involved with. Um, and at some point along the way, you get this diagnosis of myasthenia gravis.
Mhm.
Can you tell us when like what age you were when you got this diagnosis, what maybe the symptoms were that led to the diagnosis, and is it fair to say that this was the first major bump in your proverbial
Oh,
road?
absolutely. I was in my mid to late 20s. Um, I had gotten married. We'd moved to Connecticut, and I was looking for jobs, and I had some really interesting jobs on my plate up there as well. And I just was having so much trouble. I couldn't speak. I dropped about 20 pounds. I wasn't able to swallow or keep any food down. I was so tired, and that's not me. I have tons of energy. And I went to see a neurologist at Yale, Andy Packner, who studied this obscure disease, myasthenia gravis. And he was able to diagnose me. And essentially, what it is it causes muscle weakness in all your voluntary muscles. Those are the muscles that help you breathe, help you see, help you walk, help you hold and grasp things. I mean, it's a pretty hideous disease.
Mm.
About a third of the people die, about a third of the people are very disabled, and about a third of the people seem to get better. So I was of the lucky latter third, obviously, but it took over a decade, and they put you on medication that requires things to mitigate the effects of the medication. So you're constantly balancing all these drugs. And one of the things that's so hard is that taking too much of the drug can mimic the signs of not having enough in your system.
Mm.
So trying to titrate it is an absolutely impossible task.
Wow. And it must have been terrifying just to lose your functioning in such dramatic ways.
Oh, it was horrible. And I mean, talk about an identity crisis. My
Mm.
God. I mean, everything that I'd worked for that I thought was real, that was going to happen, just fell apart. Um, Part of the treatment for myasthenia at the time, I don't know what they're doing now, was to remove the thymus, which is a gland in your chest. So they crack your chest just like they would for, say, open heart surgery, and remove the thymus. And, that's, you wake up. I remember waking up, with a tube down my throat, and I couldn't speak. And they gave me a board, with a piece of paper on it. And I wrote this out with an arrow pointing at the breathing tube in me. It's
Mm.
like, just get this out of me.
Mm. Yeah. Did you, before coming, getting this diagnosis, did you anticipate that you would spend your entire life in the career you were in?
I was just feeling my way. And again, the world was very different back then. No internet, no smartphones. So it was a smaller world in a lot of ways. And you networked to find jobs. And I never had any trouble. I was always offered jobs
Mm.
here and there. And I just figured I would be following what came up, what was interesting. I was in corporate finance. It was a great place to be. I didn't really give it a lot of thought. I wasn't looking to be chairman of the board or anything. Really, over the years, I have turned out to be a jack of all trades and a master of none, which leads to, you know, a perception of semi-failure in this linear world we live in, but a really good life.
Wow, yeah, that's worth pausing on, I think, because there are expectations of, what constitutes success, and these I think really mess with our heads, because if you don't fit neatly into that sort of linear progression that you described of like whether that means climbing the corporate ladder, whether that means getting married and starting a family on a particular timeline, house, uh, picket fence, whatever it means. Um, it's an incredibly narrow. How boring would it be for everyone to live exactly that way? It doesn't fit every individual story, personality, temperament, set of talents, every individual soul. But a lot of us, I think, feel obliged to conform because the either overtly stated or um, implicit expectations is that this is what you do, right? But as you said, life can be a whole lot more interesting lived in a non-linear way where you're not just like making progress toward one or two particular goals, but you're experiencing your life and you're pursuing interests as they come and developing yourself maybe in unpredictable ways. And that's been much more my life story for sure. Um, so, and I guess every path has its trade-offs.
No, but we live in a left brain society, and we live in a
mm,
society that celebrates left brain achievement. It's linear, it's hierarchical, it's about mastering information. And we really neglect the development of our right brain,
mm.
which is that more artistic, spiritual side of ourselves. And I think that we do that at a disservice to us as individuals and as a disservice to society for that matter. And I think that the material successes that we celebrate are usually pretty meaningless, actually.
Well, I happen to agree with you. I wouldn't make a judgment call. I mean, to each their own in terms of what feels meaningful, but I very much resonate with exactly what you're saying. And I do think that here in the West, at the very least, we definitely emphasize the material, the left brain, all of that stuff. And I agree, to our collective and individual detriment. Um, so you wrote in your book, illness redirected my life, then divorce destroyed it. So how long after this diagnosis did the divorce come?
About 10, a little over a decade. So it was
Mm,
slow, it was a while in coming. And the thing that impacted me so was that we'd moved several times with my ex-husband's job. So I didn't have any sort of community around me. I didn't have my feet down anywhere. And I was found myself in a place I never wanted to be, I never wanted to live, and I didn't like. So,
check, check, check.
check, yeah. I mean, family gone, all those connections gone,
Mm.
illness still there. It was just like it would just turn my world upside down. And actually, I went on a cross country trip to visit some friends. And in doing so, I stopped in San Francisco thinking, well, maybe there's some options here. Now, meanwhile, my skills are way out of date. I don't know how I'm going to re-enter the job market. I don't know what I can do. My energy is still kind of limited. So I went down to San Francisco for a while and I rented a white Mustang convertible and I drove up to wine country. And I drove up and I didn't have any great plans or itinerary. And back then it wasn't this glitzy, alcoholic adult Disneyland that it is now. It was a lot more low key. And so I went to Calistoga, which was at best known for its mud baths. It was kind of a sleepy little town. And there was an airport with a runway that intersected the main street in town. It's a little odd. At any rate, I went up to a building. They say glider rides, and I thought, oh, what the heck? I'll go do that. And I went for a ride, and it didn't really wow me one way or the other. I mean, it was neat. The vineyards look really cool from above, but we landed, and I went about my way. And fast forward a little bit, back in Pennsylvania, which is where I was living at the time, I heard about a group of lawyers that flew gliders on weekends. So I called up and invited myself out for a 3-day weekend, and I flew for 3 days. And I was hooked. That changed my life. And you start flying in a two-seater, obviously, because you have to learn to fly. And the gentleman who taught me to fly was a World War II naval aviator. And man, I called him Silent Sam because he hardly spoke, but he could fly. And so I had to try to discern what he wasn't saying and, put it into action. But he really taught me to fly by the seat of my pants. He'd cover up
Mm.
the altitude, he'd cover up the speed. I had to be able to fly by visual
Wow.
reference and things like that. And that would come in all that kind of basic training would come in very, very handy. Um, it was a set of experiences that I never would have anticipated. And at the airfield, Sam had 3 planes. He had the Blanik, which is a two-seat trainer, and he had two 126s. And a 126 is a small single seat plane that has kind of a cult following in the aviation community. It's a fun plane. It doesn't have great performance, but it's like your first sports car. you get into the cockpit alone and
Hmm.
you have to fly this. And I remember my first flight in that 126. Um, one of the guys was holding my wing level, so the tow plane could pull me forward. And he puts the wing down and he comes and he knocks on the canopy. And I go, what is it? What's wrong? What's going on? He said, by the way, it's a little pitch sensitive. And I'm like, thanks for telling me. It was very pitch sensitive, it turned out. But
Hmm.
anyway, so I went back, held the wing, I took off and got through that. Fast forward a bit, and I show up at the airport one day and all the planes are gone. I was like, what is going on? I mean, at this point, I'm an aviation addict. All I can think about is getting up in the air.
Let me pause here, Pat, and we're going to come back to this moment,
Yeah,
but I have a couple of questions. So
sure.
first of all, a comment, which is that, this show is called The Person You Want to Be. And I think that a lot of us, some maybe earlier than others, get this sense of the person we want to be. And we get the sense of what our life is, how it's going to unfold according to our wishes. Well, I want this and that, and I want this thing and that thing, and I want to be this. Right. And then life happens. And I'm not going to say that things never turn out the way people hope and plan. How would I know? But it certainly seems that very frequently life does not go according to our plans. And then, you get, for instance, struck with this disease that you certainly would never have anticipated nor asked for. And so then the person you want to be really is uh, determined more by, well, who is it that I want to be now that this has happened? So, your plans got derailed and put you on a different path. And so, what I find really interesting in people's stories is what happens when things don't go as people want or plan or hope, and then how they determine who it is they want to be in the face of that. And we're gonna come back to that repeatedly, I think, in this conversation. But you took this road trip as a response to the pain of your life circumstances and the divorce.
Mhm.
And you end up in this sleepy town of Calistoga and you go for a glider ride. And it really didn't I was surprised when I read this in your book that it didn't really impress you that much, knowing what was to come. But clearly a seed was planted. So I guess my first question is, what motivated you to go look up, when you were back in Pennsylvania, the, opportunity to go gliding again? Do you have any idea?
Maybe a little boredom, maybe also curiosity.
Mm.
I'm one of those people who connects a lot of very disparate dots in ways that other people don't. And this was just one of those connect the dots kind of things. It wasn't an overwhelming urge to fly. It was just, check it out, you know.
Okay, fair enough. And then, once you did, as you called yourself an aviation addict, so you definitely got hooked at that point. I'm sorry. So
Well,
now
that
I'm
was only the beginning of the addiction, trust me.
yes. And also I want to ask a couple of sort of questions coming from an ignorant place of someone who does not know much about planes and flight. So you were flying gliders, correct?
Yeah, we call them sailplanes
Yeah.
actually in the community. Um,
And yeah, if you could explain exactly what that is and how it's different from a conventional plane, that would be helpful.
Sailplanes are pure magic. They have massive, massive white, well, as you get to higher performance planes, these beautiful white fiberglass wings. I mean, they're 50, 60 meters wide. I mean,
Yeah,
this is incredible. They are highly engineered airplanes that can travel hundreds of miles without an engine.
that's
That's
incredible.
that's how amazing the aerodynamics are.
How
Now,
do they get their lift?
well, there are issues with doing this. Well, first, you usually take a tow if you're taking an aero tow. A powered plane will pull you into the air, and you typically
Okay.
release around 2,500 feet. You can go higher, but that's like the typical release height. Was it 2,500 or 1,500? It's been a few years. Anyway, you release. Um, at that point, you have to look for lift. And depending on where you're flying, there are different sources of lift. A very typical source of lift is thermal lift, which is just a column of rising air. So when you see a cloud forming in the sky, that is energy condensing. Okay. So you know under that cloud there may be lift, not guaranteed, but it's a good marker and a good place to look. So you release, you go looking for lift, you gain altitude, and then you trade that altitude for distance and speed sometimes. And then as you're getting lower, you have to find a source of lift again. And
Hmm,
that's how you navigate a course.
fascinating. So it's figured out as you go
Oh, yes, it is a real exercise in terms of getting out of your comfort zone in many ways and learning to
and being
hopefully,
present. I mean, you have to pay
oh,
attention.
you're intensely present, and yet you're not. As you get more skilled
Huh.
at this, I can remember one day sitting up in the plane, the sun coming in the canopy, thinking, "Oh, I could take a nap right about now." I didn't, but you as your skill improves, you have different levels of comfort.
Sure. Yeah, thank you for that because that really helps me get a sense of it. I couldn't understand how this thing got off the ground exactly and how it carried you without an engine. But what your explanation definitely made a lot of sense and helps. And you had sent me links to some videos to give me a sense of, I mean, obviously a sense of what it's like being up in the air in one of these things. So I imagine, first of all, it's fairly quiet and peaceful because there's no engine, right?
Yeah, and as you get into better and better aircraft, it's very silent. They're very well
Wow,
sealed. And they're
amazing.
sealed because I mean it's a racing sport essentially.
Hmm.
And people do whatever it takes to have as least air resistance as possible. I mean, you tape the gap between your wing and the fuselage. You know, the cockpit is tightly sealed. You wax the plane so that anything just glides right over
Mhm.
it.
Yeah, it reminds me. I mean, I have some experience in the triathlon world. I didn't compete seriously, but I did it more recreationally, kind of like the
Hmm.
way it sounds like you were
Yeah.
approached your flying. And the obsession with being thermodynamic on bikes and the obsession with gear to take advantage of every possible efficiency in terms of speed and racing. That was never of any interest to me personally, but it is fascinating about humans and their desire to to do this kind of stuff. But the clips of the videos that you sent are extraordinary. I mean, you see just these breathtaking views and just imagining what it must be like being up in the air by yourself in one of these sailplanes with no motor, no engine, and you're just depending upon the aerodynamics afforded you by your environment and your ability to skillfully kind of navigate. And there was a line in your book, I'm going to find it here, that I think is very appropriate in discussing this. Um, it made me laugh out loud. Oh, this was the quote. It is said that flying is the second greatest thrill known to man. Landing is the first. So, yeah, this sounds incredibly brave, audacious, and exciting. And this you never would have, I mean, presumably, we don't know, right? But this presumably never would have happened had you not experienced these initial bumps in the road, correct?
Oh, I can't imagine it ever would have happened. And I think too, you have to realize that this once you gain a little bit of mastery in a sport like this, it is incredibly addictive.
Hmm.
And it's not an adrenaline rush. That's what people think. It's
Hmm.
really about skill and competency and accomplishment. And it's really quite incredible. But I think that for me, I was desperately looking to live again.
Hmm.
I talk about life wish, death wish as part of my
Hmm.
perspective during that period of time. And it's not that I wanted to die, it's just that I wanted to live. And all my sense of adventure in life that had been really experiential adventure that had been instilled in me from the time I was a kid was gone. And soaring just met those needs in spades. And it met my need to kind of get back on my feet and prove that I can do things.
Sure. So yeah, here you're coming alive with this incredible discovery and passion that you develop for flying these sailplanes, which just sounds amazing. I mean, I think I would go up perhaps as a passenger in one, and then would see what happens from there. But
Well, it's interesting. I didn't give many rides because
Hmm.
I was always worried about my health. I was the only one in the airplane, so I was only endangering myself
Mhm.
potentially. And certainly my disease became very stable, but I always had my medication with me. And it was a tenuous situation. I mean, I was crazy to do this to some degree, but
Mm.
such is life. But I remember two rides I gave. They were both out of Minden near Lake Tahoe.
Mm.
One was to an elderly, like 90-year-old lady. And it was a day where you had to just fly directly into the face of the mountain to find the lift. The way the wind was blowing, you knew you'd get lift when you got to the face of the mountain, but you had to fly right into it.
Huh.
And so I did that with her, and we got the lift that I expected to be there, and we just had a great ride, and she loved it. And then I took another person up for a ride, a gentleman about my age. We had to do the same thing. he flipped he flipped out. He's like,
Ah.
"Get me out of here." I thought, "Don't pull the canopy release. Whatever you do, just sit down and shut up, and I will get you back to the airport."
Wow.
But it was so interesting to see such different
Those,
reactions to the
yeah,
really
and
the
you
same.
you might not have predicted which reaction was going to come from whom. Um, you write in your book about an accident that stunned the aviation community that killed two very experienced sailplane pilots. And you write about the subject of control. And I found this really interesting and meaningful. So I want to just read this short excerpt from the book. Our love of the sport comes from the privilege of riding the energy of the earth to soar long distances. Soaring is a humbling and spiritual experience. It's an intense, alternate reality that imparts confidence, skill, and joy. It offers wisdom if we are wise enough to listen. Perhaps the lesson of this terrible crash that killed two luminaries in the soaring world isn't about control at all. Perhaps it's about recognizing risk and still choosing to live fully. Perhaps it's about the choice of living in love or living in fear. I love to fly. Sometimes I'm fearful. I wrestle with the contradiction, particularly after events like this. My answer is to get back in the cockpit and fly. Control, I have decided, is an illusion, a powerful illusion, but one that ultimately gives way as life goes on. Perhaps the only reality is to be truly, intensely present, to have the courage to follow your heart, to find your bliss, to live in joy, and to attempt to soar wherever that may take you. I love that passage, and I identify with that it's you have to relinquish that the idea of control is sort of almost hubris, that to believe that we
Mhm.
that we have control. I mean, certainly, right, it's relative, but ultimately we ultimately our control uh is very limited. And then it really boils down to decisions about how we choose to live in the face of that. So I really thought that you captured that quite beautifully, and your decision to understand risk but make a choice based on love and not fear. And of course, there's no one right answer to this, and there's no right answer. That answer might change on a given day, but I think that really is powerful, especially in the face of what comes next in your story, to my knowledge. And if I'm skipping a significant bump in your road, please uh, let me know.
I think
but
you're
the
on track.
Okay, but the next one that I'm aware of is your cancer diagnosis.
Mm,
Yes or
yes.
no? Okay.
Yeah, no, that was the next major bump, no question about it, and very unexpected.
Now, before we get into that, did you find some avenue for work? Um, did you reclaim your health from the first affliction that you suffered, the myasthenia?
Well, I've sold real estate when I moved out to the Tahoe area. It
Hmm.
was boring, but it did the trick.
Right.
And it gave me a little bit of flexibility too, which was good. But overall, my health was pretty good. And I worked out, I was fit, I hiked, I led a pretty healthy life, pretty healthy. I mean, I can remember some very decadent meals with like blackened ribeyes and margaritas and things like that. So my diet needed a little improvement, but that was coming.
Hmm. Okay. So tell me about the cancer diagnosis. What were the symptoms that led up to this diagnosis?
Actually, I was down in the Bay Area at a private equity meeting. I was looking at putting together a fund. Real estate was okay, but I was bored. So it was a women's private equity meeting and in Half Moon Bay. And I got so sick. I mean, I was just so sick. I didn't think I'd be able to get home. And I thought I must have eaten something. This didn't really make sense. I made it back. I made it back home and I wasn't getting better. It went on for quite a while. And I realized some of the nodes in my neck were up. And I went to see an ENT, ear, nose, and throat doc. And he took one look at me and he said, "You have lymphoma." And I said, "I do not. What's that?" you know? And he said, "No, you have lymphoma and you need to see an oncologist." And I said, "I do." I realized at that point he was talking about cancer. I said, "I don't have cancer. Give me some antibiotics. It'll clear up." So he humored me. He gave me some antibiotics. It did not clear up.
Hmm.
So I had a biopsy, which confirmed the diagnosis. And then I entered the world of oncology. And that was quite an interesting set of experiences over 6 years.
Wow. So how old were you when you were first diagnosed?
I think I was 51.
Wow. And
Not what I planned for my 50s. I thought my 50s were going to be
oh,
fabulous.
yeah. And again, it harkens back to what I said a little earlier about, the person that you want to be and aspire to be and even move in the direction of, and then life happens and sidetracks you in a huge way. Because without our health, that's the only thing that makes everything else possible, really. So I'm going to read another quote from your book. You write, 6 years of chemo, radiation, and surgery, and all the financial, emotional, and existential stress that goes with it. 6 years of my life where sometimes the chemo worked for a while and sometimes it didn't. 6 years of having my life turned totally upside down. I simply couldn't do it again. If the past was indicative of the future, I figured I had 18 to 24 months before the cancer overran my body yet again. I had weathered tumors that wrapped around my aorta, spread throughout my body, and threatened my brain. I had battled the medical establishment to get the care I needed and became my own advocate to avoid the potentially deadly medical mistakes that loomed at every decision point. I had endured almost unbearable isolation. I simply couldn't go through it all again. So
Cancer's tough. It's
that
really
happened.
tough. But
Yeah.
what's interesting about that is what led me back to my original love of writing.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, I
Do
started
tell.
a
Do tell.
yeah, I started a website, Anti-Cancer Club, which was just a beautiful website at its time. I've taken it down since because it's technologically obsolete and there's no real reason for me to keep it alive. But I had well over 20 million impressions on Twitter in 2016. It was really hitting a mark in the cancer community. And I started very slowly writing. I brought in a lot of guest writers and a lot of experts in the field. But writing was a challenge for me because I didn't have my own voice. I still didn't have my own voice. And but that's where it started. I started there, and then after this, you know, when I decided to take off and go traveling again, that's when I really dove in and started writing, and that has led me in a roundabout way to where I am now.
Yeah, it's interesting. I didn't realize that about the writing and the timing of that. But in the book, you do make mention of the fact that your response to these kinds of um, knockdowns was, once you were physically able to, was to go and travel. So I'm really interested to hear you had this prognosis, let's say, of maybe you have 2 years to live. Is that about right? Is that what you were?
It was uncertain at that point because when I went in to see my oncologist, I was vomiting blood. I was losing hair from stress over a business situation. And his response was, "We'll find something wrong with you, no problem." And I'm like,
Don't worry about it.
I've just been doing this for too long. And I left and I thought, I am just not doing this again. And I sold my house and I took off. Travel is a happy place for me, even though there's a lot of uncertainty, particularly when you're traveling homeless, not broke, but homeless.
Mhm.
And I think that growing up, travel is very experiential. And I think as I look back on my life, the way it's evolved, I've had a lot of very experiential experiences, and I tend towards that as opposed to a more linear life. And I think that taking off to travel fed that in me, and it was a way to regroup. I needed to regroup again. And I think that when you travel by yourself, it's an interesting reflection on all that's going on in your life.
Yeah, so you were spending a lot of time by yourself, but there was also some adventure, and it
Oh,
sounds
always,
yeah,
always
always.
adventure.
And it sounds like, you had begun this website.
Well, the Anti-Cancer Club, I put on hold at that point in time, and I started a blog called Cancer Road Trip. And it was really kind of a travel series about where I was going and what I was doing. But it started to evolve to become more reflective of my life. And along the way, I thought, travel is so fantastic. It gives you such a different perspective on things. And I thought, if I can do this, and I was lucky enough to be able to do this, why can't others? So I put together a project where the goal was to give 7 people every quarter an amazing bucket list trip, with the idea that they would tell their cancer story against the metaphor of some fantastic place. So the first place up was Tanzania. We could tell stories against the metaphor of a mountain and climbing Kilimanjaro, against the metaphor of survival in the Serengeti, against the metaphor of put some spice in your life kind of thing, with Zanzibar. But I lined up about $1 million, not cash in hand, but commitments to fund the first part of this, and COVID hit, and all travel shut down.
Who did you secure the funds from?
A
How
variety of
did
corporations.
Okay. So COVID hits, and then again,
I just like, you
bump in the
gotta be
road.
kidding me. This can't be.
Hmm.
And it's just everything was uncertain. Nobody knew where anything would go. And I'd worked so hard to put together a social media audience. I didn't want to lose it all. So I got to thinking I could do a podcast, but I didn't know what I would talk about. And the idea for Bump in the Road came to me because it's so exemplified my life. But I was also I'm really intrigued, truly intrigued by how people experience and navigate these bumps, and what is the wisdom that comes out of it. And that um, curiosity has not diminished over almost 4 years now of doing a podcast. If anything, it's intensified. And I have such a unique position. I have a 30,000-foot view of all these stories. So I get to see all the common traits and all the things that people
Yeah.
do or don't do, and how that comes together in a bundle of wisdom, if you will, for navigating your life.
Yeah, you use this metaphor several times, this 30,000-foot view, which is obvious where that comes from. Um,
Yeah,
but
30,000 feet in a sailplane is really cool.
that is, I was trying to wrap my brain around that. It's one thing being in a, commercial jet, passenger jet, at that altitude and marveling. I marvel every time. I'm just completely floored by, maybe that's not the best word. I am blown away, but maybe that's not the best word. I'm amazed at air travel. I think it is such an incredible human accomplishment. It
Yeah.
is I never get tired of it. When I'm on a plane and everyone like shuts the windows or whatever, getting back on their devices, I'm just like, are you kidding me? You don't want to, you're up and you're like, you don't want to see
Oh, I
the,
always get a window seat and I sit with my nose plastered against the
yeah.
window.
It's one of those things we just take for granted, or a lot of people take for granted. And it's talk about wonder and awe and, Yeah. So I was going to ask you this later, but since you brought it up, what are some of the notable common threads in, you've interviewed a lot of different people with a wide variety of stories who have overcome quite an extraordinary collection of challenges in life, often health challenges.
Mhm.
And so what would you say are some of the things you've learned from your guests about how to navigate these things in a productive and positive and even um, life affirming way?
I think for each and every one of them, they had the courage to look within. That is the first step. The answers lie within.
Mm.
Most of them had, I'll say all of them, had the courage to pivot their perspective. So, you could tell your story from a perspective of being, I don't know, angry, happy, sad, but they all found a way to pivot their perspective. I think of Effie Parks. I love her story. It just really touches my soul. Effie gave birth to a boy with serious genetic abnormalities. And so she went from this fantasy of the perfect pregnancy and the perfect mother to, oh my God, this child requires 24/7 care. He's not going to live my perfect dream life. And why is this happening to me?
Mm-hmm.
And she managed to turn that around and find, oh, sorry, it just really touches me, enormous love in that situation. And when she was able to pivot her perspective to that of love rather than why me or this is difficult or whatever, everything in her life changed. And she went on to create a podcast called oh
Something with Gene in the
yeah,
title.
something with Gene in the title. I'm spacing out on it at the moment. But anyway, she went on to create this wonderful podcast that grew out of her isolation because she realized she was just so miserable and unhappy and isolated in this situation. And she
Once
realized
Upon a Gene. I'm sorry.
Once Upon a Gene, thank you. It's a great podcast. And but she realized other people were experiencing this too.
Mm.
And her podcast could be a way of bringing people together. So in that example, she was able to really pivot her perspective and really found deep authenticity within herself. She had to let go of all these layers of this is the way life is going to be, and this is who I am, and this is how I'm going to interact to find out who she really was faced with this incredible responsibility for this young child. Um, I love Tom Cronin's story because it really goes to the mind game. I think each and every one of my the people in this book and the people on my podcast consciously take charge of their minds to some degree or another. Um, Tom is a really good example. He was a bond trader for years. Actually, I think he stayed in the business 18 years, but he started off in the bond trading business as a young man, made a ton of money. It was a wild lifestyle, sex, drugs, and rock and roll kind of thing. Lots of drugs, lots of alcohol. And he just couldn't do it anymore. And he had essentially a breakdown. And he discovered meditation. And all of a sudden, all these urges to be self-destructive essentially went away. And it changed everything in his life. He went back to his job and now he didn't fit in because all the guys are going out every night and he's meditating. He started taking his clients on surfing safaris and to the opera and doing things like that. And he totally redefined his entire professional life.
Mm.
And he went on actually to do a movie and a book called The Portal. And his goal is to get 1 billion people to meditate.
Wow.
So I think each and every one of my guests, I mean, I look at Eric Weinmayer.
Mm.
Oh my gosh. I mean, he went blind at 16. So, he'd had his sight, it was diminishing, but all of a sudden he can't see. And he went on to climb Everest, the 7 summits, and kayak down the Colorado River Rapid. How he managed to deal with that level of disability, continue his quest for adventure and a really remarkable life is astonishing. And the way he's one of the most inspirational people I've ever met. His books are amazing. And he really points to the fact that it is in your head. You have to get your mind in a good place. And I think that that's a really key piece to absolutely every single story. I look at Mary Neal. She was an orthopedic surgeon who was the head of spine surgery at USC. And fast forward a few years, she's up at Jackson Hole in private practice with her husband. They're in Chile on a kayaking expedition. She dies and has a near-death experience. And she's been in some Netflix movies and things like that. I think the thing that is so there are many things remarkable about the story, but the fact that she had to challenge every assumption, every scientific assumption about
Mhm.
her life. And she spent a year questioning her experience because it wasn't scientific, it wasn't linear, she couldn't touch it, it couldn't exist, but it did. And I find that mental flexibility to
Mm.
release your old beliefs and move into a different understanding of the world to be really amazing. And I think everybody to some degree does that. And I think the other thing that everyone does, they are in a situation where they have to let go of their past. They have to rewrite their future and they have to find what their own uniqueness. And I think that's really important because I think uniqueness is something we all have, but it doesn't magically appear. I think you have to go through a process of stripping away the superfluous and what is no longer working for you to really dig deep to find what is it that drives you at this point in time. What is it that is your purpose at this point in time? And that may change, but I don't think that process of digging deep, looking for peace, looking for authenticity, I think those are processes that can become part of your life to your benefit.
Yeah. I really appreciated your book quite deeply, as I told you before we started recording. And so I want to sort of sing the praises of Pat's book for a
Thank you.
moment. Um, yeah, it's so let's see, what can I say about this book? First of all, get it and read it. I think it would be a real blessing for anyone, especially if they are in the midst of some great hardship. I think that this is like just the perfect thing to read. Um, or if you've ever been through great hardship, it's basically for anyone. But it's let me just sort of give you some credit for what I think you achieved with this book. First of all, it obviously reflected a great amount of work, just sifting through the interviews you've done and distilling them down, choosing 15 guests. I really liked the way the book is structured. It's very it's organized in a very specific way. It's here's one thing that I really appreciated. It's both extremely accessible, it's highly readable, it's not a difficult read, and it's also quite profound. It's quite deep. So I love that combination. Also, the chapters, for the most part, are organized in a similar fashion where you introduce an idea, you tell something of your own story related to that idea, you share the story of a guest you've had on, and then you share an actual excerpt from the interview, and then you conclude it with some thoughts to reflect upon about your own life, and you make some key points. And it's just beautifully put together. It's very easy to it's both easy to take in and it takes time to digest. And so it's kind of book you can go back and reread and work with. And I know that you offer all kinds of extras that are available to people who get the book, that
Yeah.
are yeah, do you want to talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, I put together an online component because there was so much more that I wanted to share. There's a workbook that actually gives you some exercises you can do to drive home some of these key points in your own life and reflect on your own life. But also, I wanted people to have access to the original podcast. And some of the podcasts are in my premium section on the website for subscribers only. But I wanted people who bought the book to hear the podcast in its entirety because there's so much to be gleaned from intonation, accent,
Mhm.
how people say things. I mean, when we speak, we don't speak in sentences. We speak in a more disjointed, emotional, nonlinear kind of way. And distilling that actually into something you could read in a linear way was much more difficult than I thought it would be. But I really urge people to go and listen to the full podcast because it really gives you a flavor of who this remarkable person is in their own words.
Yeah, hear it from the source.
Yeah.
Yeah, so I want to just give you a lot of kudos for completing this thing, and for what was very abundantly clear to me as I read it was how much heart you put into it, how much how much care you put into it. It's very clear to me that your intention for this is to help people and to give people, instill some hope. And the stories contained within of your own and of your guests, they're both heart-wrenching and deeply inspiring. So,
Yeah, no, it
um,
covers the gamut. It really does. And thank you very, very much. This this is the first of a series of books. This was much more difficult than I thought it would be. And
yeah.
I'm very grateful. I'm glad I did it all. But oh my God, it's like everything else in my life. I had no idea what I was getting into.
Yeah, sometimes naivete can be our friend, right? Like we would never take on a venture if we really understood in advance what was involved.
What is it Eric said about climbing Everest and everything else? He said, I ended up doing all this because I'm impressionable.
I listened to that interview. Yeah, that was an interesting way of putting it. I think what I took from that is it meant he was open to suggestion, but in a very beautiful way. Like
Yeah.
because he was willing to entertain ideas for himself that were far greater than ones he would have imagined for himself. But when someone else suggested it, he was able to consider it, and I think that's a lovely quality. And yeah, his story is pretty extraordinary and inspirational. Um, just observationally from what you shared when I asked you about those connecting threads among the guests, there were some things that stuck out to me as well. When you talked about Effie's story in particular, her starting her podcast took this, what you could very, very, accurately call a tragic situation, and she turned it into an opportunity for connection and for community, and infused her life with purpose, by sharing this story and helping people feel less alone and gathering people together who had similar challenges. And you did the same with your cancer road trip, despite getting derailed by COVID, and with your Bump in the Road podcast and book. And I think that what could be more meaningful than taking the most difficult thing in your life and using it, putting it to some positive, productive use, and using it as a means of forging meaningful connections with other people and helping other people and putting it to some use so that it's not just this horrible, tragic, terrible, awful thing. It's going to be that anyway, but so you might as well derive something useful and positive out of it. And that's sort of like an underlying message that I got from your
Well,
book. Yeah.
you know what it is? We all are the same. I mean, we all have the same emotions. Now we have different experiences and different life paths, and we may react differently, but we're all bound by common emotions. And I think seeing how other people emotionally deal with things
Mm.
can be very meaningful to your life, because one of the things I want to point out about this is none of this incredible evolution of these stories happened in a year or two. Most of this took years to unfold. People go through periods, myself included, of being utterly lost, not knowing what to do, not knowing what's up or down. And somehow in this mess, you're supposed to distill some sort of path forward. No one tells you how to do this. I mean, I think there's more help available these days in terms of psychological help and things, but certainly when I was younger, none of that was there. And I think that people need to know that life is messy, and you go through these really messy, difficult periods, and that is normal.
Mm.
And you are on the right track if you're trying to do something that resonates with you. And I think the key is just put energy into your situation, whatever it is. It doesn't matter if you go off on the wrong path. There's no right or wrong path to begin with, but it's the essence of putting energy into it. You'll find your way, but it will not be easy or instant. And wisdom is only earned in retrospect. You don't have wisdom going through it. So that's why I think stories with wisdom can be so helpful, because they can help us make sense of these incredible bumps that everybody hits.
Yeah, and even if we can't fully internalize the wisdom in an instant by
Yeah.
reading someone else's words, they can provide a map, and they can, I think, like most importantly, just provide hope, like realizing that this is survivable, this is doable, there's the life isn't over, and there's we can again put this through the through the agency that we have to do the things you mentioned about, pivoting, about uh, awakening to new ways of looking at the world or looking at things or looking at our situation, the mental flexibility piece that we can be led to really experiencing ourselves in ways we otherwise wouldn't have, and
Mhm.
in wonderful ways we otherwise wouldn't have. And a question that you ask almost everyone, I think, on your podcast is you ask if they could rewrite their story and take away the tragic bump in the road that they experienced. Would they? Have you had anyone? And obviously, people would say people would never wish for these things, and we don't want to in any way romanticize uh, these just incredible difficulties that, let's face it, none of us would choose. But when you ask if they would rewrite their story if they could, have you ever had anyone say that they would? I
I think one person did, and I can't
huh.
remember who that was, but almost everybody says no. Now, people may hem and haw a little bit like, well, if I could really rewrite my story, that would be, yeah, that'd be interesting, but I wouldn't be where I am. And I think the point that everybody comes to is, oh, sure, I would do things differently. I'd love to have some things happen differently, but I wouldn't give up where I am for anything.
Mhm. Yeah. And I think that a common, thread is that these people took these unbelievable challenges, and they're heart-wrenching. The woman who was a breast cancer surgeon, what was her
Oh,
name?
Liz O'Riordan, yeah.
Wow, that story just
It's and unfortunately her cancer is back.
mm,
So she's, starting to go through treatment again now. She's coming on the podcast a little bit later this year. Oh, is it later this year? No, I'm publishing her in October. Um, Liz is somebody who's made such a profound difference as a patient, much more so than she ever would have as a surgeon.
yeah, crazy.
And I don't mean that to in any way denigrate her amazing
Sure.
skills as a surgeon, but she stood up. She stood up and she really laid out the nitty gritty of how horrible this disease is and what
Mm,
people are going through and what people are experiencing. And for her, it just turned her world upside down because she went from this kind of pristine surgical world where you do the surgery, you move on, you don't, there's nothing else really, to seeing what lay behind the curtain. And it was not very pretty. She has really changed the conversation around breast cancer significantly.
yeah. So these stories are massively inspiring, and
Oh, yeah.
they're, you know, I think it's an important point as well to emphasize that these are human beings just like you and me, and we think of them as extraordinary hearing their stories. But to your point, and to what we were talking about just before we hit record, we all are imbued with this, if you want to call it the human spirit, whatever you want to call it, we all have access to these qualities, and unfortunately they often don't become clear to us until we're in a position where we have no choice but to take them on, courage, resilience, etc. um, but it's amazing to me how these things can be awakened by you call them bumps in the road, which again, every time I use that, I just thinking that is like the most understated way you could possibly say it.
Yeah, but
uh,
part of it's intentional because
yeah, of
these
course,
things
tongue in
really are
cheek.
tough.
Yeah.
I want to provide a little levity because ultimately they're all feel good stories.
Hmm.
They're all really good, inspiring stories that I think we can all learn from. And it's like you don't know happy until you know sad. You don't know hot until you know cold. I think that each of these stories really exemplifies the fact that until you really hit a bump, man, you don't know what you can do
Yeah.
or what you can learn.
Yeah. So I have a couple more questions about your personal journey before we wrap up. And thank you
Mhm.
again, Pat, just for everything that you're doing. I find it very heartening, the work that you're doing. Um, you at some point, I believe it was during that 6 year 6 years of dealing with your cancer. At some point, you tell this. Actually, it's a very funny story in the book about your incredibly annoying neighbor, and But you discovered meditation yourself, and can you tell us a little bit about that experience? And I know that you were that it was transcendental meditation, correct?
Yeah. Um, wow. All right. I had the neighbor from hell. And among other things, they put a 9,000 square foot house just about on the property line, legally, within legal limits, but it just hovered over my house. And once it was done, while the construction was going on, I was going through chemo, so that wasn't very pleasant. And they didn't care. They didn't care about anybody. But anyway, they moved back in the house, and all of a sudden they'd been so quiet, and they become party animals, and their stereo is booming, booming, booming. The bass was so strong that I watched the windows in my house suck in and out with the pounding of the bass. I mean, it was horrible. I was sick.
Hmm.
And in order to deal with this new monstrosity on the property line, I had to re-landscape my yard. So, I have all this heavy equipment in, everything's being dug up, trees are being torn out, which was heartbreaking to me. And I went out one night in this rubble that had become my yard, my previously lovely little backyard. And I just looked up at the sky, and something from within me just came out, and I just screamed. I just screamed and screamed and screamed, and I didn't know where this was coming from. And the bass is booming away, and nobody can hear me over the music. And it's like the proverbial, if a tree falls in the forest, does anybody hear it? So obviously my life was not really very coherent. And I read about a meditation class over at the museum, and I thought, okay, I'll sign up for this. I was just searching for anything at that point. I was facing a possible transplant, just nothing. Life was looking pretty upset. So I go to the meditation class. We do a different type of meditation every week. And I decide at the end, I will do a transcendental meditation class, the whole class, and learn to meditate. And with TM, you get a mantra, which is what keeps you focused, and you meditate twice a day. I clung to this. It was a lifeline for me. I meditated twice a day, no matter what was going on, where I was, what was happening, I would meditate. And it absolutely has probably been one of the most transformative experiences of my life. I think mental health is so incredibly important. And I know for me, meditation is a key piece of mental health. After some of the things I've been through, and after cancer particularly, I'm very attuned to the need to pay attention to your mental health, to your mindset, to what you're doing. And meditation, for me, is the answer to that.
Wow. Is it still something you practice?
Oh, yeah, absolutely. I've been meditating for over a decade now.
Hmm.
And I think the things that are interesting about it, I tried to break it down in a short podcast the other day. And there's a number of aspects to meditation. One is discipline, which is a bad word these days. Everybody wants Instagram perfect gratification. I hate to clue you, it isn't real, it doesn't exist. But you have to have some discipline because it's a practice, and you have to just keep working at it. And it's not like, doing something more linear where you can, check off different points where you've achieved something. This is a lot more vague. So it really you have to stick with it. But you find that as you start to discipline your mind, it carries over into all facets of your life, and you start to develop much greater awareness. Now, with awareness, all of a sudden you can start to see your thoughts, and you can start to see your monkey mind. And once you can see your thoughts, now you have the ability to make a conscious choice whether or not that thought is real and whether or not you want it.
Whether it's
And
helpful, yeah.
yeah, and if you're really into digging into your own authenticity, what you'll do is dig down to the root of where that thought came from and ask yourself, is that something I want to release? And chances are it will be. But I think the other thing that's really interesting about meditation is that it's experiential. It's like eating chocolate. You could read a description of what it's like to eat chocolate. Okay, fine. It's intellectual knowledge. It doesn't mean anything. But eating chocolate, okay, you put something in your mouth, it melts, you feel, the whole experience.
Hold on, Pat. I think that the guy who wants to get a billion people to meditate, I think you've just sold meditation. It's like eating chocolate. There you go.
Yeah. But it's experiential, and so is meditation. And so out of that comes a knowing, just like what chocolate tastes like. you all of a sudden know your mind and you know your existence in a different way. And that experiential aspect of it, I think, is what builds and really can be life-changing over time.
Pat, one thing I'm interested to know is you mentioned that you didn't have a particularly religious or spiritual orientation growing up, but through all of the trials and tribulations and life experiences you've lived, I'm curious to know how you view spirituality now.
Now I'm a very spiritual person now. I would say that life is a spiritual journey. And one of my mantras, if you will, is what can I learn? Every time an interaction with a person comes up or a situation, it's what can I learn about me? And I think that's part of a spiritual journey is greater self-knowledge. And that leads to greater kindness and acceptance across the board. Um, I think I think I think my spirituality developed gradually. Certainly flying was a part of it.
Mm,
Nature, I think, is a place where people find a great deep spiritual connection. And for me, nature was just in the sky. I mean, how
mm.
can you not fly down a mountain range at 200 miles an hour and not be absolutely awestruck at it all? It's incredible. And I think in the book, I tell a story that kind of sums it up. It's a story that for me has been very powerful. I was flying over Tahoe one day, 16,000 feet or so. And Tahoe's beautiful, those emerald green waters and turquoise. And a little bit of snow on the mountains. It's just gorgeous. And I turned the plane, and the winglet at the end of the wing balances on a bubble of air. So this 8 or 10 inch winglet is holding this entire 15 meters of wingspan up in the air, and we're circling and we're just going up and up and up. And I get up to, I won't say how high since there are FAA limits on how high we're supposed to go. But FAA is the Federation Against
Mhm.
Aviation, by the way.
Nice.
But I'm up there and the water below, sun streaming through the canopy.
Mm,
And it was a moment of eternity, is the only way I can describe it. It was a moment of oneness, of connection, of almost moving to a different realm. It was just incredible. I don't know how long it lasted. It doesn't matter. It was,
mhm.
again, experiential. And I now know that this other dimension exists. And one of the ways to get there is through presence. When you're intensely present, time slows. And that's when you find these amazing gaps of being in the flow or having an absolutely outrageous experience.
Beautiful. Thank you for sharing that. So this is like your journey is a very compelling one, a very winding one. It's filled with there's a lot of sadness in your story. I mean, I really felt for you. Um, but you've managed to come through this far and have these experiences you never could have imagined for yourself or anticipated. You've reconnected with your love of writing, and you're using it in service, in a service oriented way, as I see it, with helping get other people's stories out there, and you know, providing inspiration to people going through any manner of hardship. And so I really just applaud you for all of that, and for, in the words of a favorite uh, musical group of mine, taking a sad song and making it better.
Well, thank you. I am where I am meant to be. I love my guests. I love their stories. I love the wisdom that comes out of it. And I get to meet extraordinary people and I get to connect with them in a meaningful way. And that means a lot to me.
Yeah, I totally get that. So we're going to wrap this up shortly, but I just want to ask you at this point, first of all, how are you doing health-wise?
Knock on wood, pretty good.
That's wonderful. Wow. And I'm curious to, you mentioned that this is the first in what's going to be a series of book projects. So
Mhm.
I'm interested in what is on the horizon for you, and also how you view the person that you wish to be now at this stage, given all that you've experienced and lived through. How do you see that now? How would you answer the question of who it is you wish to be now and moving forward?
I'm actually very grateful for who I've become.
Mm.
Um, I like myself. I'm incredibly imperfect. And I'm perfectly happy with all my quirks.
Mm.
Um, I want to just continue what I'm doing now with the podcast, with the book series. I'm looking at books that focus a little bit more on a specific segment, like Bump in the Road, Strong Women, Bump in the Road, Cancer, Bump in the Road,
Mm.
Sports, because I think that those are topics that resonate with people. But really, I'm just so grateful to be where I am. I'd like to add a little bit of speaking to my repertoire
Mm.
because I want to get out and I want to tell these stories. These are just such remarkable stories that people really, really need to hear.
Beautiful. What would you say on the subject of rewriting your story? And specifically, not recreating, not if you could redo it, not that, but rewriting the story you've been telling yourself about the thing that happened to you. That's, because that's another
That's
theme in your book.
that's a good question, and it's one I've actually worked on a lot because I think we all get stuck in different aspects of our story.
Mhm.
And one of the ones I've really had to work on, frankly, was my divorce because would have been very easy just to be angry over the whole thing, which I was for a while. But now, when I look back on it, oh my God, I'm so grateful. It
Mm.
gave me the freedom to do what was right for me. It removed me from a situation that could have been really could have evolved in a way that was not very good. Um, I look back and while it's kind of ugly, it's okay. It turned out to be kind of pretty too.
Nice. So that's the wisdom that comes from that you really can only be gleaned from the perspective of experience. And but that idea of being grateful for the difficult things, I think I don't know if that's ever, I don't know how doable that is in the midst of it. Maybe there's room for it. I'll allow for room for it. But certainly in retrospect, when you look back, it's more than possible to feel gratitude for the things. My dad once made this offhand comment to me: be thankful for all the people you never married. And I love that comment. You could apply it to be thankful for every job you didn't get that you thought you wanted. Be thankful for everything that didn't work out because it's what allowed you to get where you are now. It's what opened up these possibilities that may not have otherwise been available to you. So I think it's just a really healthy way of um, reviewing your own life story and finding a lens to view it with that's empowering as opposed to just feeling like a victim, right?
Absolutely. And you have that choice. It's up to you.
Yeah. Pat Wetzel, thank you so much again for this conversation, for your podcast, for your book, for your spirit. And where would
Thank
you
you.
direct people who are interested in finding out all the good things that I just mentioned, finding out about them?
Come on over to the website, bumpintheroad.us. Um, and we're on all major podcast platforms as well, but there's a ton of stuff on the website. And the book will be out mid-September. And there'll be information on the website about the book. And of course, it'll be on Amazon.
All right. And I really genuinely endorse this book. I'm not
Thank
being,
you.
I get nothing out of saying that. I really feel like it's really so worth, I don't even know what it is, what it costs, but I'm telling you, it is, it's a beautiful book. It's something you can gift to people. It's something you can gift to yourself. There's a lot of wisdom in it. It's very easy to read. It's very inspiring, and it can send you on down all these lovely rabbit holes should you choose to go down them online as well with the extras that Pat has provided digitally. So thank you again, Pat. Is there anything else you would like to say to those viewing or listening?
Thank you. I'd like to say thank you, Eric. This has been really fun and interesting. And I deeply appreciate being on your podcast.